In this video, we're going to discuss which architecture you might use for your iOS project. Generally speaking, if you're asked about architecture in an interview, the interviewer often wants you to favour the architecture they're using within their organisational context. However, even if they're using MVC, which we'll come on to in a minute, they also want to see some understanding of solid principles. So MVC doesn't really offer much flexibility, but we'll come on to that in a second. And the other thing that they really want to see a grasp of is understanding that the architecture must be fit for the problem that's facing the organisation or the problem that needs to be solved with an application. So that might be something like having deep links within an application. So let's have a look at the basics of the architecture, but there's links for the solid principles and each architecture within the video description. So that might help you as you follow through this video. So here's a rather basic interpretation of the MVC architecture. You'd probably see something more complicated in, shall we say, real life, but this gives an example of some of the pitfalls of using this architecture. Not that there's anything intrinsically wrong with it, but it's kind of out of vogue in the iOS world. So let's have a look at this example. When I look at the simulator here, when I click on download, it downloads more items and just takes me to this modal screen. Nothing special. You go from the tab bar controller to the view controller and it lets this modal appear. So the issue is this is not particularly reusable. I've named it API in view controller to make this really clear. The API call is made from within the view controller. So if you think of it as this view controller only works with this API, it will only work with this particular URL without making changes to the view controller. It's just not very good because you can't reuse this view controller. Also, you start to think, the view part of the view controller, it's within the view controller. It's not separate, so you can't use different components. Also, we're tightly coupled to this other detail view controller. We can't easily go to other view controllers very easily. So from the viewpoint of now, 2022, you'd say this isn't very satisfactory. So perhaps you'd want to look at other solutions, except if you want a quick and dirty project to test the concept, you might want to use this. Anyway, moving on. One of those criticisms people give of MVC is massive view controller packing all of the information into the view controller. So we have an alternative to that. It's called MVP, where the presenter, the P in MVP, presents the data to the view controller. So the view controller and associated views can be much dumber, and it's one level of abstraction away from the model. So this menu you might have in the presenter all of the model. So here we don't really have that because the data is just some strings, but you could have an extra class here which would be the model. So then the view knows nothing about that model, so then the model can be swapped out or changed with no requisite change in the view controller. So that would be a very nice thing. And just to show you how this app works, just displaying the data, so then we've got an extra view controller and view presenter coupling here. Links in the description if you want to go through this a bit more. So MVVM is intended to split the logic out from the view into a view model. Now admittedly, I'm showing here one of the most simple examples can possibly have. It just displays text on the screen. And not only that, my view model, which is here, is not bound to the view controller. And if you draw a diagram of this, it will look incredibly like MVP. But actually, lots of people implement MVVM, frankly, as MVP in iOS, and people are generally okay with that. So when we talk about bindings, we're talking about adding something like RxSwift or Combine into the mix, which makes it a bit more complicated. Basically, it's the same argument as MVP here, that the model is separated out from the view and view controller. Again, there's a link to this code in the description and a full article about this, so feel free to take a look, but this is quite common as an MVVM example, and the next one with coordinators is also something you might see within businesses. So here I have an implementation of MVVM-C, and the C stands for coordinator, so it takes the routing logic out of the view. Now usually I'd like to put the coordinator in the view model, but I haven't done so here. I mean, you can go either way on it, but it's probably better in the view model rather than in the view controller like in this example. But anyway, the routing for, say, the project coordinator takes out the navigation controller and the flow logic out of that view controller and into this coordinator. I will say one thing about this particular example. It is that I've created a dependency factory which is injected, and dependency injection is a very worthwhile thing, but is kind of out of the scope of this particular video. The idea of this video is just to show the different architectures, and this one is not too bad at taking that routing logic away from the view controller, so I'd say is a step up from MVVM. So, if we've talked about MVVM-C, which is taking the coordinator out of the view controller, you're getting closer to a situation where you're matching up with the single responsibility principle. Each class should do one thing and one thing only. And Viper helps with that. You've got a series of classes that potentially only do one thing. You've got the view controller in Swift, but yes. We have the wireframe, which is also known as the router, that does pretty much the same as before, moves to the various screens. You've got the presenter, which we're familiar with, and we have the interactor. Now it's the interactor that can start performing data functions. So we can get our data from the interactor, we can use the presenter to format the data for our view, so the view can be dumb and just display things on the screen. And you have this router part that simply, routes. And it makes everything reasonably easy and reasonably comprehensive in the way that everything has a single responsibility. The disadvantages, of course, there are a lot of files here, so you have to deal with all of those files, and to just create a simple application, you have a lot of, overhead. And there are some simple scripts that create these files for you. But the question is, if you need a script to create all the files you need, are there too many files? The answer is that it depends on your project. I don't want to talk about MVI too much within this video because it's kind of how things are done in Android, and also it's kind of been replaced with Swift UI, as in it's all about state. And also the third thing is here I've used RxSwift for the bindings. The app I've made just displays two names, which is from the model. So basically you have a store which stores the state. You have a state, which is just some structure, just some information. And then you have a reducer that evolves the application state based upon the actions it receives. You have, as you might expect, a view controller, but that acts upon what is in the intent, which is bound to the view controller. Another name for intent is action, and the interaction modifies the intent that modifies the model. So all of these things happen in turn, and in this case our model is just a struct with a person's name. So it's not immediately obvious how this works, but it will be familiar to people who are familiar, say, with React Native and that type of web developer. Is it really in use in iOS coding? Of course it is. Of course it is. But you might, if you want to go down this type of path, look at SwiftUI. I've included service-oriented architecture here because many people will say it's another architecture that can be used. However, it's kind of not to do with views and view controllers the way the other ones are. And the case in point is this project I've created here. Basically has a view controller and view model without bindings, so you'd argue something like MVP. And here in the app delegate, I'm creating an analytics service, crash reporter service, and persistent service. And you could create your network service here as well. You could use some injection to put that in your view controller. I've not done so here. But it's just at this point in the app delegate, you can create these services. This is just a demo, like the analytics service doesn't actually do anything. Crash reporter, kind of don't have one. You could set a Firebase there, this type of thing. Persistent service could do something smart with coordinated there. Now, this brings us to the point of what is an architecture, and I think this is best placed in a roundup. So, I'll see you there. So this video, it's about which architecture you might choose for your project. And the answer is, of course, MVVMC. No, of course it's not. The real answer is it depends on your project. Just because everyone's choosing MVVMC now doesn't mean that you should, doesn't mean that it's right for your project. And when you're thinking about this, look through the examples, but they don't tell you how your project actually looks. That depends on the problem you're solving, how data is used around the project, and also how the user navigates through the project. So that means just using a coordinator isn't enough. Doing things like having child coordinators might not be enough, depending on how you're moving the user around the project. And it's quite a big topic area, but I hope showing you these examples has gone some way to help you in your coding journey. Anyway, hope this has been useful. Maybe see you next time. Thank you.